Ghost looked at him in silence. Jon slumped against the wall, hands around his knees, and stared at the candle on the table beside his narrow bed. The flame flickered and swayed. The shadows moved around him. The room seemed to grow darker and colder. I will not sleep tonight, Jon thought. Yet he must have dozed. When he woke, his legs were stiff and cramped, and the candle had long since burned out. So in part 1 we established something that was perhaps obvious. A powerful actor is influencing and guiding events at the wall. But in part 2 we went into something that was perhaps not so obvious, that the direwolves, namely Ghost, were tools for directing the fate of Jon Snow. And we made a rather bold claim. Ghost is telepathically influencing Jon's decisions. Our evidence last time was perhaps on the thin side. Jon made a few peculiar, perhaps illogical decisions in the presence of Ghost. He joined the Night's Watch, thinking himself to have no future, when in fact there was hope of him being a lord in the new gift. He befriended Sam Tarly, someone no one has ever befriended before, and was unusually open with him. And from seemingly nowhere, he had a eureka moment on how to save Sam Tarly that produced the side effect of him being chosen to be Jeor Mormont's squire. Yes, these are all odd events, but hardly definitive proof of supernatural brain tampering. And so let's try to strengthen our argument a bit. What other evidence is there that Ghost is messing with Jon's head? Well, the evidence we presented is from the first half of the Jon story in A Game of Thrones. So let's look at the much more bizarre second half. After Jon and Sam graduate from training, the first thing they need to do is swear their vows, and Jon, being a northerner, naturally chooses to do so in front of a heart tree, and so a group heads up to the weirwood grove north of the wall for the ceremony. Now it's here, near the weirwood grove, that Ghost finds 2 dead bodies, crow companions of Benjen, that later rise as wights. Needless to say, this is a pretty significant event as it leads to the Great Ranging. And keep in mind, it's only Ghost who can find the spot where these bodies lay. Later hounds, who have a comparable sense of smell, find nothing. Freezing does reduce the emission of odor, but also there is something about the bodies that unnerves the dogs and horses and makes them not want to go near. Not Ghost, though. He has no fear of going near these bodies and seemingly knows exactly where they are. And yet this is Ghost's first time roaming north of the wall. How did he know where the bodies were? Simple chance? And why wasn't he unnerved like the other animals? Simple direwolf courage? It's important to note that the bodies were in a location where the Night's Watch would certainly be, near the weirwood grove, implying that someone wanted these bodies found. And yet they were hidden enough that Ghost was needed to find them. It does appear that someone wanted these bodies found by Ghost for the Night's Watch. And this is not just my presumption. Jeor Mormont himself specifically notes that Ghost led the Night's Watch to these bodies, and he believes that someone or something meant for Ghost to find them. But who? Who put the bodies near the grove? And who led Ghost to the bodies? Well, let's stop for a moment and try to solve this mystery. We could suppose that the wildlings or the others left these dead bodies here in order to have them brought inside Castle Black to try to sabotage the Night's Watch. But there are problems with both groups as suspects. If it were the others, how did they know Ghost would lead the watch to the bodies? Controlling live direwolves is not a power that we know the others to have. Dead direwolves, sure, but not live ones. So unless we find out something different about the others' abilities, we can eliminate them as culprits. So what about the wildlings? Well, they do have powerful wargs and skin changers in their ranks, but wresting a direwolf from a warg is described as a challenging task. Perhaps a skin changer as powerful as Varamir Sixskins is capable of it, but he specifically notes that he didn't do so. And even ignoring the problem of controlling Ghost, the wildlings can't be the culprits as they don't have the ability to raise the dead and control them. No, whoever left the bodies here would need to 1. Have the ability to influence or control Ghost, and 2. Have the ability to control the dead. When it comes down to it, other culprits would have no guarantee their bodies would be found, and wildling culprits would have no guarantee their bodies would rise and do their bidding. At the end of the day, the only characters in our story who have been shown to have the ability to both skin change animals and control the dead are Bloodraven and the Children of the Forest. And of course, the bodies were found near a weirwood grove, allowing for Bloodraven and the children to watch both the placing of the bodies and their retrieval. With that mystery solved, let's continue on and talk about what happens to Jon when they return with the bodies. Back at Castle Black, Jon finds out that Ned has been arrested, and Jon spends the rest of the afternoon as if in a dream. He is unsure of anything except that Ghost is with him, giving him silent comfort. Sometime later, he hears Alliser Thorne insult him and goes berserk. He instantly tries to kill Sir Alliser, and it takes 3 of his friends to take Jon down. Now we should note that Jon rages and gains super strength at another time in our story, right before Ghost's return in A Storm of Swords when fighting Iron Emmett, when we know that Ghost was having influence on Jon. Now Jon's rage against Alliser Thorne is fairly inconsequential, as Jon is simply confined to his room where he would have been anyway that evening. But it's noteworthy that Jon is acting odd. He's walking around as if in a dream, aware of only Ghost, and raging at people with super strength. Now it's the next part of our story that has the most significance. After being confined to his quarters, we have this passage. Ghost looked at him in silence. Jon slumped against the wall, hands around his knees, and stared at the candle on the table beside his narrow bed. The flame flickered and swayed. The shadows moved around him. The room seemed to grow darker and colder. I will not sleep tonight, Jon thought. Yet he must have dozed. When he woke, his legs were stiff and cramped, and the candle had long since burned out. So Ghost looks at Jon, Jon stares at a candle, and then Jon loses time. Now, losing time is a fascinating phenomenon in our story. It happens to various characters like Catelyn before she oddly releases Jaime, and it happens to Sam before he oddly flees from Craster's Keep with Gilly and the babe. And notably, it happens to Sam here. Aleras nodded at the glass candle. Sam stared at the strange pale flame for a moment, then blinked and looked away. Outside the window, it was growing dark. Now this scene with Sam at the Citadel is a clear parallel to Jon's scene in his cell. The 2 men both stare at candles and lose time. And in the case of Sam with his glass candle, we should note that he loses time because of a supernatural, telepathy-oriented device. If the parallel holds, then Jon too is being manipulated by a supernatural, telepathy-oriented device, likely a direwolf. And what happens next to Jon is very, very convenient. The wights rise and one kills the guard outside Jon's room. Jon then snaps out of his blackout at just the right time for Ghost to lead him up to Mormont's room, where the wight is about to kill Mormont. Mormont is then saved by Jon and Ghost, but yeah, it's mostly Ghost doing the saving. Later, even Jon recognizes this. Of course, there is no reason for Jon to have awoken at that exact moment, and there is no reason why Ghost would know that Mormont was in trouble. And it's worth noting that if Jon had awoken later, Mormont would be dead, and had he awoken earlier, say to the sound of his guard fighting the wight, he would have encountered the zombie on the steps, and there wouldn't have been a heroic rescuing of Mormont. No, the situation was perfectly set up for Jon to be the hero. His guard is killed, Ghost leads Jon to Mormont, and Ghost does most of the work in the fight, while Jon takes all of the credit. And this all happens within hours of Jon walking around like he's in a dream, raging, and then mysteriously losing time in the same manner as someone looking into a telepathy device. And this is where we can confidently switch from saying that the evidence is thin that Ghost is messing with Jon's head, to saying that it's thick. Jon losing time is a rather blunt example of telepathic manipulation, and it's especially so when we look at its parallels to Sam losing time with the glass candle. And it's rather clear that someone or something is trying to influence events at the Wall through Ghost. And it's not just my supposition that Jon's being guided by his direwolf. The characters in our story claim this.
Your Lord Father sent us to us, Jon. Why, who can say?
Why? The Raven called.
All I know is that the blood of the first men flows in the veins of the Starks. The first men built the wall, and it's said they remember things otherwise forgotten. And that beast of yours, he led us to the wights, warned you of the dead man on the steps. Sir Jeremy would doubtless call that happenstance, yet Sir Jeremy is dead, and I'm not.
Lord Mormont stabbed a chunk of ham with the point of his dagger.
I think you were meant to be here, and I want you and that wolf of yours with us when we go beyond the wall.
Now let's examine what Mormont is saying here more closely. Mormont says that the events at hand are not happenstance, that Jon was meant to be here. That's passive voice, that last part. In active voice, Mormont would be saying that someone or something means for Jon to be here. And Mormont sees all of the events as connected, one grand plan. Someone or something means for Jon to come to the Wall, for the Night's Watch to find the wights, and for Jon to save Mormont. Now, Mormont specifically says he doesn't know why Ned sent Jon to the Wall, but we actually do. Last time we established that the direwolf prophecy convinced Cat to send Ned south and she refused to let Jon stay at Winterfell. At least in part, it was the direwolves that made Ned send Jon to the Wall, and in full if we accept that Ghost is messing with Jon's head. And we are fairly certain that these direwolves were sent by Bloodraven and the Children of the Forest as they were so essential to Bran's development. Not to mention Mama Direwolf needed access to the Black Gate to get south of the Wall. And related to this, it's rather conspicuous that Mormont's Raven seems to answer Mormont's question of why Ned sent Jon to the Wall. But even without that information, Mormont still comes to the conclusion that Ghost, the direwolf, is part of the grand plan, noting that he found the wights and enabled the rescue. And this part of the plan does align with the idea that Bloodraven and the Children of the Forest are the controlling actors, as they are the only ones who can both skin change direwolves and control the dead. Not to mention they can see out of the weirwoods where the bodies were found. And if Jon was meant to join the Night's Watch, as Mormont thinks, then it also seems to be that the controlling actors want Jon to stay in the Night's Watch. In the rigged election of Jon Snow, we discussed how Jon was dissuaded from taking Stannis' offer by Ghost. And in the final chapter of A Game of Thrones, Jon attempts to desert the Night's Watch to join Robb. Jon rides south, but Ghost disappears, making Jon stop to wait for him. This allows Jon's friends to catch up to him, and it's Ghost who ends up making noise, alerting them to where Jon is. Jon himself even blames the direwolf and thinks that Ghost looks at him knowingly. According to Jon, Ghost wanted him to be caught. And so at this point, we have quite a bit of evidence of direwolf influence on the Jon story, and we can actually start mapping out the plot and what we've already talked about. So in part 1, we discussed how the Blue Rose is actually the A Dance with Dragons story. A chink in the wall is caused by our Lord Commander's sympathy for the wildlings. And how did we get here? Well, there's actually two plot lines, really. There's Jon's story, which actually has more to do with Jon's feelings about the wildlings, the sympathy part. He takes vows, keeps vows, and reinterprets vows. And there's the Sam story, which has more to do with making Jon Lord Commander. Jon shows leadership qualities, and in turn is given leadership opportunities. So with the Jon story, we have Jon joining the Night's Watch, which we talked about in part 2, which leads to Ghost discovering the wights and Jon staying on the Wall, which we talked about in this episode, which leads to Jon's story in the Great Ranging, which leads to Jon's journey with Corran and the Blue Rose, detailed in the schemes of the Half Hand, which leads to Jon joining the wildlings, egret and sympathy for them, which later leads to Jon's actions in A Dance with Dragons, Daggers for Jon. But we also have the Sam plot, Jon befriending Sam Tarly and saving him, which we talked about in part 2, and this leads to Sam's story with the Great Ranging, where Mormont and everyone else dies off, we have Sam's flight, and then we get to the rigged election of Jon Snow, which makes Jon Lord Commander for Dance with Dragons. And we can see how much direwolves, specifically Ghost, guided these actions. They put Jon on the Wall, facilitated a friendship and displayed Jon's leadership. They found the Wight, saved Mormont, led to the Great Ranging. They kept Jon on the Wall. They guided Jon with Corran. They gave Jon dreams and even led to Jon being caught. And they helped rig an election. We can see the degree of meddling in the Jon story by a powerful actor is rather extensive. It led to Jon joining the Night's Watch and becoming Lord Commander, as well as Jon gaining sympathy for the wildlings. But we still haven't answered a big question. What does the powerful actor want? Well, there is one more piece to the story that answers this, and those are the events that happened to Jon and Sam on the Great Ranging. It's a plotline that doesn't have to do with Jon's sympathy or Sam making Jon Lord Commander. This third plotline, the heart of the Great Ranging, has to do with the others, and we will discuss this and more in part 4. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.